We're on Daf Kuf Gimel Amid Beis. And we're up to Tanur Rabbanan, which you'll see towards the top of the Amud. We'll count down from the top, approximately 12 lines, and the line starts with Tanur Rabbanan. And the Brisa is going to address the question of whether or not you have to own the nal. There's the choletz, and she has to take off his sandal, his shoe, as part of the process of chalitza. And now the question becomes, does he have to own the shoe with personal ownership? And in the psukim, there seems to be a clear indication that he has to own the shoe, because the Torah says v'cholatz na'alo. Na'alo means that it's his shoe, he has private ownership. Ein li ela na'alo. And the Brisa continues, na'al shel kol adam minayin. What happens if he doesn't own that na'al? And the Brisa says that's kosher also for chalitza. Perhaps ideally, if everything was equal, it would be his na'al, but it's not critical. And how do we know this? Talmud Nomar na'al mikol makom. So the Torah on the one hand says na'alo in the possessive, and then it says na'al, which means mikol makom, even if he doesn't own it. So the Brisa asks him, Kain ma Talmud lomar na'alo? Why did the Torah confuse us by saying na'alo, when in fact the Torah adds the word na'al to indicate that he doesn't have to own the na'al? So why did the Torah say na'alo? And the Gemara answers, na'alo haro'ilo. It's got to be a na'al that fits his foot. Prat legadol she'eno yachol lalach bo, uprat lekotan she'eno chofer rov raglo. So this excludes a na'al which is too large, and if he walks with this na'al, shoe is going to fall off. And it also excludes a small na'al, again, relative to the size of his foot, and it doesn't cover most of his foot. Uprat l'sandal hamisuyam she'en lo okev. This also excludes a broken sandal that has no sole. And therefore, the Brisa is saying that chalitza is valid even if the yavam does not own the nal. As long as it's a nal that fits his foot, it covers most of his foot, it's not going to fall off because it's too large, and it has a sole. Abai havikame, let's just make sure we have the place. And you'll see at Tosfos, Dibra Maskel Mitame, here on Daf Kuf Gimel Amid Beis. And if you draw a straight line from that Tosfos, you'll see the word Ekev. And after the word Ekev, Abai. So Abai havi koi kame to Rav Yosef. Abai was in the presence of Rav Yosef. Haso Yevamot lachlots. And a case of Yibum came in front of Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef is the presiding Dayan, he's the rabbi, and Abaye is a Talmud of Rav Yosef. Amalei, Rav Yosef turns to Abaye, and he says, Havle sandalach, give him your sandal for the purpose of chalitza. And this clearly indicates that the choletz does not have to have private ownership over the sandal, because Abai did not transfer ownership over the sandal. Yoevle sandal de smola. He gave him the sandal from his left foot. Apparently, Abai was, in a sense, he was taunting the Rebbe. He was sort of like challenging him. We know that if all things are equal, chalitza should be performed with the right sandal, When I say right, I mean the correct right sandal from his right foot. And Abaye deliberately took off the shoe from his left foot. Amalei. So Rav Yosef questions Abaye. Amar Diamar Rabbanan, when did the Rabbanan say that you can have chalitza and it's valid even with the left shoe? That's only b'di'evet. But l'chatchila mi amar, if all things are ideal, then certainly we want to use the right shoe. Why did you give me the left shoe? Now Abaye has Rav Yosef in a bind. Amalei, Abaye responds to Rav Yosef, says, Ihachi, if you're trying to set up a chalitza in the ideal lechatchila way, then sandal sheina shalo nami lo. Why are you telling me to give my sandal to him? That's only b'di'evet. Amar di'amar Rabbanan, and he mimics his Rebbe. His Rebbe said the same words, word for word, with regard to the right sandal as opposed to the left sandal. Is l'chatchila mi'amar di'evet. It's okay, you could use someone else's sandal. Let me grab your sandal and I'll use it for chalitza. But that's only b'di'evet. L'chatchila, certainly, we would want to use the na'al that belongs to the yavam, because again, the Torah says na'alo in the possessive form. Amalei, so Rav Yosef says to Abaye, you misunderstood me. When I told you to give him the yavam, the choletz, give him your shoe, what I meant was, hachika minale loch, hav le v'yaknile. Give it to him as a gift. And here the commentaries point out you can give what's called a matana manas lahachzir. You can give a gift on the condition that you get it back. I wasn't asking you to walk around barefoot, Abaye, but give him the sandal, your sandal, as a kinyan. Let him make a kinyan on it. And then it becomes his sandal. But with regard to the left shoe, that's not going to help. Again, but the evidence kosher, but l'chatchila we want to avoid it. Now, the Mishnah told us that a sandal shel eitz, if you have a wooden shoe, then it qualifies for chalitza. Mantana, who is the author of that shita, that even a wooden shoe is valid for chalitza, Amar Shmuel Rabbi Meir. It's none other than Rabbi Meir. And we're going to quote Rabbi Meir from our Mishnah. Rabbi Meir in our Mishnah is going to address the question of an amputee, of someone who has what's called a kav, and he has a wooden foot that he steps on in place of a natural foot because he doesn't have a natural foot. Divrei Rabbi Meir, Rabbi Yossi Oseh. Rabbi Yossi says that a wooden kav, a prosthetic foot which is made of wood, is not kosher for chalitza. So if in our Mishnah we qualify a wooden shoe, that must reflect the Shita Rabbi Meir. However, Avur de Shmuel Omer, Shmuel's father said, "B'mechupa ar b'direi hakol." When the Mishnah validates a wooden shoe, it means that it was covered with a coating of leather. And even Rabbi Yossi, who disqualifies a wooden shoe, that's because it's not covered by leather, by a hide of an animal. But if it's covered by leather, then even Rabbi Yossi would validate the shoe for chalitza. And this, despite the fact that the shoe is really a wooden shoe. It's only coated on the outside with leather, but that's enough. Omar Rav Papa, Rav Papi, Mishmei Derava, Sandal Hamuzgar, Lo Tachlos, Bovim Cholza, Chalitzasa Kshera. So what is a Sandal Hamuzgar? Muzgar literally means when you lock something up. like, for example, you remember, hopefully we're not going to get to this again, but when we had a hezger, people were not allowed to go out of their homes. And that's what a sandal hamuzgar is. It's confined. What does that mean, the shoe is confined? And here we have a case of tsaras. And a metzora may have come in contact with this shoe. And this sandal, therefore, becomes contaminated. And Rav Papi says, in the name of Rava, lo tachlotzpo. This is not a good idea to use a shoe that might have been contaminated by metzora for the purpose of chalitza. Now, to explain this, we need a little bit of a background about tsaras. And we're talking about what's called nigei begadim. We're not talking about a physical dermatological skin disease. We're talking about let's call it a phenomenon that attacks begadim, clothing. And depending upon what the color is, because now the clothing got discolored and it appears to be a very dark color, like a deep green or a deep red. And it's on any sort of beged. A beged could be made of leather, it could be made of wool, it could be made of linen. And now the Kohen will do what's called a hezger. He locks it up for 1 week. And at the end of the week, he has to make a determination whether the tsaras spread or not. Now we have a similar case, what's called nigei batim. If there's a discoloration on the walls of a house, again, a green or a deep red, and the Kohen, once again, locks up the house for a week, and at the end of the week, he'll make a determination as to whether or not the tsaras has spread. And if the tsaras has spread, then after the second week, if it still is exhibiting the same kind of phenomenon of discoloration, that will confirm the tsaras. The Kohen will declare the house as being contaminated with tsaras, and then there's a mitzvah of nititza, which means that we demolish the house. Now, in our case, we have a sandal that has perhaps been contaminated with tsaras. It was put in that state, you remember, for a week in which it's confined, and we don't wear such a beged. It's locked up for a week until the Kohen comes at the end of the week to re-examine the beged. Now, why does Rav Papi say lo tachlotzpo? What is the problem with a confined beged, or in this case, a confined sandal? Rashi points out that this is a gzera d'Rabbanan, and we have to understand why the Rabbanan made a gzera here, invalidating this nal, which is a suffix nitma, suffix lo nitma, for chalitza. Apparently, even though the beged is now in a state of hezger, so we don't know definitely that it's mitzora, but there might be a confusion in the minds of the spectator. They're going to think, you know what? Last time there was chalitza, the rabbis validated this sandal that was confined as tsaras, because we didn't know yet to determine that it has tsaras. And let's use even a confirmed shoe, a nal or a sandal that's already been absolutely confirmed. The Kohen saw it, and he saw that the contamination and the discoloration is spreading. Im cholza chalitzasa ksheira, sandal amuchlat, but if the Kohen has absolutely confirmed that this sandal is contaminated with tumas nigei b'gadim, then im chalza chalitzasa psula. Now, why is that? What invalidates the chalitza with the shoe that otherwise is in perfectly good shape, but has been confirmed with taras? Now, in the case of batim, we said that once we confirm the bias as having contracted tumas batim, then we have to destroy demolish the house. In the case of gadim, the Torah requires sreifa. You have to burn something. If the beged has been confirmed as a mukhlat, that it is tamei v'tumas nigei b'gadim, and it's ton sreifa, it needs to be burnt. And that's going to invalidate it for a nal of chalita. Why? Because anything that requires a certain size, and again, the nal of chalitza has to fit the shoe, the foot of the choletz, then if it needs to be burnt, it's considered as if it's gone already, as if it's consumed. It doesn't have any physical substance according to Jewish law. And not long ago, we were learning in Masechet Sukkah that if you have a lulav that was worshipped as part of an Asherah idolatry cult, then it needs sreifa. And if it doesn't have the size of a lulav, physically, it's a lulav. But halachically, it's lacking in the shear. That's called kituse mechta shiura, and it cannot be used. Now, we have a principle that goes as follows. That which is earmarked to be burnt is considered as if it's already burnt. If the halacha requires sreifa, then it's considered as if it doesn't exist anymore. And any object that requires a minimum shear, a minimum size, like, for example, a lulav, as we mentioned before, is now disqualified. And so, too, in the case of a chalitza shoe, it's disqualified. So now we have a gzera of Muzgar Atu Mukhlat. If we allow you to use a nal of chalitza, which is Muzgar, you'll come, perhaps, on another occasion, to validate a nal of a Mukhlat, which is absolutely possible, completely invalid. However, in the case of a Muzgar, b'di'evid, the Rabbanan are not going to put their foot down and disqualify the chalitza, but the chalitza is kshera. So all that is Rav Papi in the name of Rav. Now there's another Amora by the name of Rav Papa. He too is a Talmud of Rav, and he has a different tradition about Rav. Rav Papa mishmei de Rav Omar echad sandal amuzgar ve'echad sandal amuchlat lo tachlis bo v'imcholza chalitzasa kshera. That even a sandal which is muchlat and has the absolute standard and status of tumas nigei b'gadim, and it has to be burnt. Nevertheless, b'di'eved, it is a chalitza kshera. And the question is, why is it that this chalitza is valid when, after all, kol ha'omed lisaref is kisaref dami? And it seems that according to this version of Rava rejected the principle of kisaref dami. And now the Gemara is going to actually bring a Mishnah from Masechet Negoim to support Rav Papa and suspend the principle of Kisarav. The Mishnah, deep in Masechet Negoim, says, Bayis hamuzgar metame mitocho, but muchlat mitocho umeachoro. So we differentiate now between a muzgar and a muchlat. As far as a muzgar is concerned, it only conveys tumah to that which is inside the house. So let's say, for example, you enter into the house and part of your body now comes in contact with the inside of the house, then you contract tumah. But the outside of the house is not tumah. Masha'en came in the case of a mukhlat, that's mitami both from within and from without. And even in the case of a muzgar, if you enter into the house, you contract tumah. And that would apply even in a case where you didn't touch anything in the house, but most of your body has entered into the house, and therefore you become tamei, even though it's only a muzgar. And all this is based on psukim in the Torah. The Torah says, "Tzoras memameres he, babayis tamei hu." And why did the Torah have to add these words, tamei hu? To teach us that once the house has been confirmed, that's called a mukhlat, it has an additional conveying tumah even from the outside. The Torah also tells us that if one comes into the house, he shall become tamei, and that refers even to a muzgar, and certainly a mukhlat. So now, what are we going to do with this Mishnah and use it as a question, an objection against Rav Papi? Isak daita kinemechates dami. If you're going to tell me that once the house is confirmed after the mukhlat, then it's considered as if it's mukhtas, it's considered as if it's demolished, because we have to demolish the house, then v'habe'inon ve'haba el habayis v'leka. Rav Papi, you're in a vicious cycle over here, because the Torah says that who contracts tumah? Someone who goes into the bayis. But according to Rav Papi, there is no bayis, because the Torah says destroy the bayis. And we're holding now kituse shiura. And the Gemara rejects this by saying, Omer Kra, this is different, because the Torah says, V'natatz es habayis. And even though the Torah is talking about netitza, to demolish the house, it calls it a bayis. Afilu b'chas netitza kori bayis. That for the halacha of bayis, in order to convey tumah, the Torah recognizes and grants the status of a bayis even to something that's got to be demolished. Toshma, another kash on Rav Papi. And this is from a brayso about a matlis. Matlis is a small cloth. Sheyesh bo sholosh al sholosh. It has 3 by 3 etzbos, and such a cloth is already considered a beged as far as Kabbalah's tumas tzaras. So he's got the minimum shear of a beged. Now, it's very strange. You have 3 etzbos on 3 etzbos. That's really small. It's like a little patch of cloth. Why is it considered a beged? I mean, you can't wear such a thing. And the Gemara says that if you have a rip in your clothing and you want to put a patch on it, this size is a standard patch size. And they sell it actually packaged in that way. So it has the chashivut of a beged. Now the Mishnah, the brayso continues. We're going to talk about a cloth which has very, very fine threads. So the Brisa says, Afal pisha einbo kizayis. The threads of this cloth are very, very fine, very thin. And what the Brisa is establishing is that even though it doesn't have the size of a kizayis, but nevertheless it has gimel al gimel its bows, that's automatically a beged. Now, again, this particular statement in the Brisa has to be understood in the broader context of Tumah V'Tara, and usually the minimum shear for anything that's Tomei to convey Tumah is a kizayis. For example, if let's say a corpse, a dead body, if you carry it or you come in contact with it, you contract Tumah's mess, but only if you come in contact with a kizayis. That's the case where, the body of the corpse is not whole. It's been dismembered. But here in the case of Nigei Godim, we don't care whether or not the beged has the shear of a kizayis. It's able to convey tumah even if it doesn't have the shear of kizayis, as long as it has the shear of gimel al gimel etzbos. Then the Brisa says, Kevan shenichnas ruba lebayis tahar tim'asu. So he has now a beged that has contracted tumas tzaras, and now the beged enters into the house. And now we're saying that once the beged enters into the house, timasu, it conveys tumah to all the kalim in the house. Now, for this, we have to know again more about tumah. Generally speaking, only an avha tumah could convey tumah to kalim, but a secondary tumah, like a vlada tumah, sheni tumah, could not convey tumah to kalim. But here, the Torah is teaching us that once this beged contracted tumas tzaras, it has the din of a first degree tumah, and it's mitame kalim. So the Gemara asks the following question. According to a puppy, once a beged is muchlat, it has to be burnt, and it's considered as if it's already burnt. My lav muchletes. How can you tell me that this beged could convey tumah because it has the shear of gimel etzbos when the halacha requires that we burn the beged? Because it has the shear of gimel etzbos. But according to you, once we designate it for burning, it no longer has the shear. So how could it be makabel tumah? Now we can add a little bit of an embellishment to the Gemara's kasha. The Brisa establishes that when this beged enters into the bias, it conveys tumah to all the kalim in the bias. But that's only if you assume it's got a shear of gimel etzbos. But now you're telling me ha'omed lisarif kisarif damim muktas kesed michtas shiura. It doesn't have a shear of 3 tvachim. Of 3 by 3 etzbos, and therefore, how could it possibly convey tumah to the kalim in the bias? So Gemara says, "Lo musgeres." We're talking about a beged that was in that state called hezger, It has not yet been confirmed. It's only confined. And therefore, there's no din of sreifa. Hence, it has the shear of gimel etzbos and a shame beged, and therefore it can convey tumah to the kalim inside the house. Let's look at the rest of the brisa. Now we're talking about a much larger piece of cloth that has a volume of many zaysim. And apparently now we're talking not about the case that we had before. You remember where the threads were very thin and fine. Now we're talking about coarse threads. So the entire cloth measures 3 etzbos square, 3 by 3 etzbos. And since it's made of coarse threads, it could very well be that even a small part of it has the size, the volume of a kezayis. Is kevan shenichlas mimena kezayis lebeis tar tima'aso. Once a kezayis of this beged entered into the house, then it conveys tumah to all the kelim, the vessels in the house. This would make sense in a case of a beged that was already muchlat and has the status of vadei tzaras, vadei tumas tzaras. Hainu de iskash lemeis, just like we said that you contract tumah from a corpse if you come in contact with an olive size of the basar mess. So too, by virtue of this analogy, this equation, we're going to say that big day tzaras, meaning the nigei begadim, also have the same halacha that they transmit tumah if they have the size of a kezayis. And that makes sense if you're talking about a muchletes. If you're talking about an earlier stage, when it's confined but not confirmed, amai iskish lemes? Why should we equate it with a mess and come up with the shear of kezayis? And the Gemara answers, in defense of our puppy, shiny hasam the amakra, in the parsha in Vayikra Yud Gimel of Tzaras, the Torah says, "V'saraf es ha-beged." You burn the beged. Afilu b'shas sreifa karui beged. So that this is the exception to the rule. The rule is that anything that's torn sreifa is completely pulverized, demolished. But in this case, the Torah went out of its way to indicate that it still retains its status as a beged, even though it's ready to be burnt. For ligmar mineh, why don't we derive from a binyan av a general conclusion that if the Torah calls a beged even something that has to be burnt, then even if a nal shel chalitza contracts tumas tzaras, it could still be kosher because it still has a shem minal, just like a beged of 3 by 3 etzbos that contracted tumas tzaras is still called a beged. And therefore, when that beged enters into the house, it's metami all the kelim in the house. And the Gemara answers, Isur mituma lo gamrina. When you're talking about chalitza, the purpose of chalitza is to be matir and isur. Her status after the death of her husband is that of isur, what's called Yevamot ashuk. She's not allowed to get married until such time as she receives chalitza. And the now is being used here to remove that isur of Yevamot ashuk. So we're not dealing with tumah here. We're dealing with isur v'heter. And now you want to derive a halacha in kitutze mefta shiura from a beged as far as Kabbalah's tumah is concerned. Well, I have news for you. Kabbalah's tumah l'chud and Isa v'Heteluchu. These are two worlds. And there's no cross-pollination here. We don't derive one halacha from the other. So Einach Hinami, as far as Tum is concerned, once it's a muchlat, then despite the fact that it's Ton Sreifo, we still consider it as a beged. The Torah calls it a beged. But with regard to Isur v'Heter, like for example, the case of Chalitza, the purpose of which is to be matter and Isur, then we view the beged as if it were Kituse Mechta Shiura, completely disintegrated, and it cannot be used as a nal of Chalitza. Omar Rava Hilchasa Echad Sandal Amuzgar, the Echad Sandal Amuchlat, the Echad Sandal Shal Avodas Kochavim, Lo Tachlots, the Imcholta Chalitzasa Ksheira. So we have now a list of cases of a sandal that requires streifa. For example, a sandal hamuchla, or another example, a sandal shel avodas kochavim. We'll see the case in a minute. And in these cases, we're going to say that b'di'eved, if they use such a nal, then the chalitzas ksheira, we could validate it. Now, in the case of a sandal amuzgar, we understand this very well because there's no requirement of streifa. In the case of a sandal hamutlat, once it's been confirmed, as we said before, it requires streifa. But nevertheless, the Torah calls it a beged, so therefore, in the case of a nal, it's a valid nal for chalitza. Now, what about avodah zarah? That's a challenge. Why don't we apply Kituse Mechta Shira to Avodah Zarah? He took this shoe and he puts it on the foot of an idol. Don't we require Sreifa? So apparently, it depends why he put the shoe on the foot of the idol. If he wants to protect the feet of the idol when the idol is taken from place to place, so although that is asur ba'ana, but it doesn't have the requirement of sreifa. If, on the other hand, he attaches shoes to the idol on a permanent basis, and then he brings sacrifices to the idol and all that stuff, then the shoe becomes what's called tikroves avodah zarah, and it has to be burnt. So if he had a nal that was used in the context of tikroves avodah zarah, that nal would be completely possible for chalitza, because it's Ton Sreifa and Kedusei Mechta Shira. Now, based on a Gemara in Avodah Zarah, we're going to suggest another alternative shot in this Gemara of Takroves with the Nal. And the Gemara in Avodah Zarah on Daf Nun addresses the following case. The idol worshippers used to bring gifts to the idols. And you could see this even today. Again, I don't know what the status of Buddhism is, but if you go to countries where they worship Buddha, I mean, they'll deny that they worship Buddha, but whatever it is, you'll see that they bring gifts to the Buddha doll. Those gifts have the status of tikroves avodah zarah. A gift that's brought to an idol as part of service to the idol is avodah zarah. It requires sreifa, according to Jewish law. And here's a case where they gave an interesting gift to the idol. They gave him a pair of shoes, or at least one shoe, a right shoe. And again, it may sound like a joke to us, but this really was common practice back in the days of idolatry. That shoe is now completely disqualified for chalitza because it requires sreifa. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah actually compares it to a dead body based on a pasuk in Tehillim. And a dead body is osir ba'anoli olam, and so too, an offering, a gift to an idol, is like a corpse, and it's osir ba'anoli olam. And the only thing you do with it is burn it. And bittul doesn't apply. Bittul means when you nullify something. Like, for example, in certain cases, you can have something that's awesome, you did avodah zarah, but if you chop off a piece of it, then that's called bittul, and it's no longer prohibited under avodah zarah. But that doesn't help us here in the case of tikroves avodah zarah. And now we turn to Kuf Dalet. Shel irani dachas, the shoes that were taken from a city that worshipped idolatry, and the Torah requires sreifa. So if Rov Ha'ir, most of the Jews in the city worshipped an idol or idols, that gives it the status of irani dachas. And the final ruling on the city has to be issued by the Sanhedrin Agdolah, the highest court in Israel of 71 judges. And there are two sets of laws here. One law has to do with idol worship. The people who deliberately worshipped idols, which unfortunately makes up most of the city, they require sayef. Normally for avodah zarah, the punishment is skila, stoning, but here it's beheading. And that's because of the special din of irani dachas. Then we burn down the city, and all the possessions that belong to that city, meaning of the residents of that city, all have to be burnt in a fire. They find the shoe is earmarked for sreifa, has to be burnt. And therefore, it cannot be used, and it is even b'di'evet disqualified for chalitza. Now we're talking about tachriche hames, shrouds in English. And anything that's designated to be buried with the dead is asur ma'ana. And the Brisa quotes a case of a zaken where we have to give respect to a zaken, an elderly person. And lichvodo, they dedicated shoes. Now, it seems that the shoe was made while the person was alive. And here we enter into a famous world-class sugya in Shas called Hazmana. And there are two opinions about Hazmana, whether Hazmana milsa, Hazmana lab milsa. Hazmana means when you earmark something and single it out for a certain purpose, whether that registers in the halachic universe. Lo tachlot, v'im cholza chalitzasa psula. Amalei Ravina l'Ravashi, Maishna zaken asu l'kvodo. Why is it in the case of a shoe that was made and prepared for the funeral of a scholar or of an elderly man, and we say that that shoe is completely invalid for chalitza? And the answer is the lavli lucha of it, because you cannot enjoy walking in the shoe. The shoe has to be dedicated to the dead body. To beidina nami lav lehilucha dami. Now, back in the day, and this is true even today, the Bezdin would designate a certain shoe for chalitza to make sure that it had all the requirements of a nal for chalitza. Now, no one's walking around with these shoes. They're in the bezdin, permanently locked up, only to be used on rare occasions. Amalei, so Rav Ashi responds to Ravina, Ilu mazgi bei shlucha de beidina, mi kapra le dayana. In other words, even though it was designated by the bezdin for chalitza, in a case where, let's say, one of the apprentices who work in the bezdin, what do you call that in like medical services? You know what I'm talking about? Anyway, so there are people in the service of the bezdin, and one of them needed a shoe. He didn't have a way of getting help. So on a temporary basis, he asked if he could use the nal of chalitza, and the bezdin allowed him to do so. They weren't mocked. So therefore, if the judges would not object, it indicates that it could be used as a shoe. But not so in the case of a shoe that was designated as tachrichim for a mess, then no one is allowed to walk in those shoes, and therefore it loses its shame now. The Mishnah says, Chaltza b'layla, if the chalitza took place at night, chalitzasa kshera. Rabbi Eliezer posted. Now, normally a bezdin would not sit at night, and they have to issue their rulings during the day. And Rabbi Eliezer applies that to the halacha of chalitza, and he invalidates the chalitza. And the Gemara is going to analyze this machlokes. Bismol, if let's say she's called the Yevamot, the widow, if she performed chalitza with her left hand, with the left foot of the Yavam, chalitza psula Rabbi Eliezer machsh. The Gemara says, Lema b'haka miflagi. Let's analyze this machlokes recorded in the Mishnah between Rabbi Eliezer and the Tanna Kama with regard to Laila. The Mar Savar Makshinon Rivin Linegoyim. According to Rabbi Eliezer, we have a hekesh. And Rivin are monetary disputes, Riv, like in the Parsha of Shoftim, and that's compared to tzaras. Now, the law of the Kohen who has to examine the tzaras, he has to do it by day. And that's derived from a pasuk in Dvarim, Valpihem, Yeh kol riv v'chol nega. And monetary disputes are compared to tzaras, and tzaras has to be examined by day, as the pasuk indicates in Vayikra Perek Yud Gimel. So now we know that tzaras has to be examined by the Kohen by day, and the Torah compares in this pasuk riv and nega, teaching us that the Kohen has the authority to render judgment in monetary cases and to rule in tzaras cases. And by comparing the two, we say that just like tzaras has to be examined by the Kohen by day, so too we have a hekesh of rivin to tzaras. And by comparing monetary cases to tzaras afflictions, and tzaras afflictions have to be by day, so too monetary disputes have to be educated by day. Chalitza also involves monetary issues because she has a right to claim a ksuba after chalitza, and therefore we should require that the chalitza take place by day. Mar Savar, but the Tanna Kama holds, Lo makshidin rivin linigoyim. He never accepted that hekesh between riv and nega, and therefore the fact that the Torah juxtaposes monetary disputes with tzaras afflictions does not teach us anything, and there's no basis for the assumption that chalitza has to be performed by day. Lo, the Gemara says no. Kuli amalo makshinan rivin l'negoyim. Even Rabbi Eliezer agrees that there's no such thing as a hekesh to compare tzaras afflictions to monetary cases. Di makshinan is afilu gmar din balayla namilo. Meaning, even if you began by day and you finished at night, that would still be disqualified. And the Mishnah tells us in Sanhedrin on Daf Lamed Beis that in all monetary cases, if you begin by day and you issue the final verdict at night, it's kosher. So it means that the reason that monetary cases are judged by day could not be based on a comparison to tzaras, because in the case of tzaras, there's no such thing as hischil b'yom v'gomer b'layla. What is the subject of machlokes? Mar sover chalitza kitchilas din damya, umar sover chalitza kigmar din damya. Rabbi Eliezer equates chalitza with hascholas din, and hascholas din requires yom, so therefore chalitza requires yom, and laila is a posel. But the Tanakama holds that we compare chalitza to gmar din, because chalitza is the end of a process of being matir the Yevamot l'shuv. And therefore, it's clear that chalitza could take place at night, because gmar din, even in the case of monetary disputes, can take place at night. Rabba Bar Chia avad uvda b'muk u'b'yechidi u'b'layla. So it was a case of chalutza. He was alone, the only presiding judge. It was nighttime, and the footwear was made of muk, of felt. Amar Shmuel, kama rav guvraya di ovid yichida. If you can rely on a minority view, you must be great. You must have what we call breita places. And, the implication you get is that Shmuel is making this as a facetious statement. How great does he think he is, this Rabbi Bar Chia, that he can rely on a das yachid and institute a chalitza. If let's assume that the reason why Shmuel was upset here is because of a felt shoe, is stomatanya. We have a brisa that validates footwear that's made of felt. Elila, stomatanya. We have a brisa that validates chalitza at night. Ella yechidi kakasha. Actually, what bothered Shmuel was the fact that Rabbi Bar Chia officiated alone. Hechi ovid b'yechidi. How is it possible that he had no bezdin and he did it by himself, alone? Diyechidah k'tanila. And there's one yechidah, one dissenting view against the majority that allows for chalitza with only one judge presiding over the chalitza. The snan, we learned it in Mishnah. Later on the next Amud, and the Mishnah says that cholza b'shnayim or b'shlosha v'nimtzeh b'emkarav apostle chalitza psula. So we see clearly from this Mishnah that we need judges, and one judge is not sufficient. And that's why if you have Nimtza Echemem Karav Apostle, you're left without three judges, it's possible. And Chalitza is like Din, and you need a minimum of three judges. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan, Asandol Machshirin, although there is one opinion mentioned here in this Mishnah that would qualify and validate such a chalitza, And the Mishnah tells us, there was even a case where there was no bezdin at all. And they performed chalitza in the privacy of him and her, or in a case of, and where were they alone? They were in a beis hasurim. But Ma'aseh Lefnei Rabbi Akiva v'hichshu, and Rabbi Akiva validated this chalitza. Yomer Rav Yosef Bar Miniyom Yomer Rav Nachman. Ein halacha ka'osa azuk. We don't accept the dissenting view, the minority view of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yochanan. And that means that you need judges. You need a bezdin. And Shmuel said, how could Rabbi Bar Bachia preside over Chalita without any other judges? Ibai is saying another explanation why Rabbi came under attack by Shmuel. Kulo nami yichidak tani luhu. In all aspects of Rabbi Bar Chia's ruling, he was relying on a lone Tana. The Sanya will enter the Bryce Omer Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi Yossi, Ani Reisius Rabbi Yishmael ben Alicha, Shechalatz b'muk, b'yechidi, u'balayla. So we see this is only one view that would validate chalitza with the footwear felt and at night, and without three judges presiding over the decision over the chalitza. So therefore, Shmuel objected to all three aspects of Rabbi Bar Chia's actions. Okay, then? We'll stop here. Thank you. Thank you so much.